Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to Attila invades the Western Roman Empire, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, 451 AD. This is part 2 of 2. So if you haven't seen my reaction to the first part, I suggest you check that out before checking this one out. So this is about Attila the Hun and the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. And as I've said in my other 2 videos that react to anything related to the Huns, is most of the history that I know about the Huns was when I used to play Age of Empires, and that, unfortunately, that's to my shame, that most of my historical knowledge on the Huns was from Age of Empires. So the first part was, if I remember rightly, all about, like, you know, the dealings with different barbarian groups and the pretty much the disintegration of the Roman empires and all the backstabbing, the politics. Because a quote that I remember from when I read about when I used to play Age of Empires, at this moment in time, this wasn't the Rome of Caesar, but it was a Rome that was like had loads of internal corruption and multiple barbarian wars, so it was a shadow of its former self. And if you remember, at this point in time, because the Roman Empire was so vast, it was too vast to be ruled by one city effectively. So it had two empires, one at Rome and one at Constantinople, which is now modern day Istanbul. So I'm trying to keep this. I'm not going to rattle on. Excuse me. I'm not going to ramble on too long. So the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't give so much of a proper reaction, it's because it's probably obvious I don't know much on the subject, and I'm also trying to take in on some new information. So anything I do know, I might be able to chime in with, but other times I might ask some, you know, questions out of curiosity, like if someone can fill in those blanks in the comments. So yeah, the link to the original video will be in the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go subscribe to History Marsh. They're a brilliant history channel, just like Epic History TV and Kings and Generals. So without further ado, let's get this up on screen and let's get into this and see how it plays out. One thing I should point out, and again, this is what I remember from when I played Age of Empires, that, and apparently according to other historical sources, that Attila's shamans, they examined the earth and the colour of sheep bones, and they prophesied that the Huns would be defeated at the Catalaunian Plains or fields, whatever you want to call them, but the general of the opposing army will be killed. So Attila thought that's a fair trade. So now I only just realised that in the last video it's the Roman general's proper pronounced name is Aetius, not Aetius. So let's see how this plays out.
Hey guys, if you missed part 1 of this mini-series, you can find it here.
If you haven't checked that out, go check it out before checking this out.
In moving against the West, Attila insisted he was not an invader, but someone who is claiming his right as the Emperor's future brother-in-law. And with Honoria as his wife, the Hunnic...
Yeah, because he got a letter from Honoria in Rome, even though Attila was plentifully supplied with wives.
King would get an opportunity to take over Gaul and continue the previous policy of supporting the West against its enemies, with the added benefit of territory within the empire and a direct connection to the throne.
Wow.
Rarely, if ever, was Aetius caught so completely off guard. Upon receiving word of the impending invasion, he set out from Italy to Gaul.
Wow.
Valentinian offered very little support, but Aetius brought with him the Auxilia Palatina. Although few in number, these were first-rate troops, capable of holding firm in line of battle, as well as conducting more mobile operations. Nevertheless, even when combined with his main force in Gaul, Aetius still didn't have the numbers to defeat the invaders. If you ever wanted to play as the most powerful hero in the world, now you can do it on demand with the world's biggest and most badass mobile game, Raid Shadow Legends, the Executioner, and Executions.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It seemed that the Roman general faced an insurmountable problem. For over 20 years he relied on the Huns and Alans to stamp his authority on the Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and Burgundiae. But now, with Attila on his way, he had to turn to his enemies for help.
Wow.
Realizing he could never persuade Theodoric to join him, the ever-resourceful Aetius sought assistance from Avitus. A prominent Roman aristocrat, Avitus once served as a praetorian prefect of Gaul and was a personal friend and trusted advisor of the Visigothic king. He appealed to Theodoric that now was not the time to settle old political scores with Aetius. Now was the time to throw in his lot with the Romans to stop Attila. Persuaded, the king marched out of his capital. Diplomacy and charm produced what no war could have achieved, a force that could confront the greatest barbarian army yet to threaten the empire. For Aetius, however, the alliance with Theodoric was a marriage of convenience. He was forced to seek help and would have to make concessions to the Visigoths, but had no desire to see their power grow. His plan was to stop Attila, but to also remain the most powerful warlord in Gaul, and he would strive to prevent Theodoric from exploiting any victory against the Huns. Meanwhile, the Huns crossed the Rhine in the spring of 451, with contingents of Franks coming in from the north to join them. Attila had split his army into smaller bands to make foraging easier. Concentrate...
Yeah, because the only alliance that I remember, the Huns alliance, the only allies that I do remember that allied with the Huns in this battle was the Alans and Ostrogoths, while the Romans teamed up with the Visigoths under Theodoric the First.
His forces only near walled settlements. Assaulting and capturing a city would have given his army loot, slaves, and additional supplies. However, when confronted by well-defended cities, he could not afford the time needed for siege operations and could only try to rely on fear to gain entry, offering to spare the inhabitants from a horrific sack in exchange for provisions and shelter. And if the gates remained closed, Attila would have probably kept moving. The Hunnic army captured and sacked Metz in early April, then proceeded to cut a swathe through the countryside.
Wow.
Without organized Roman standing forces, the invaders were virtually unopposed. Logistics dictated their movement much more than tactical considerations.
Yeah, because in the Huns were pretty much like the Mongols under Genghis Khan. There was a lot of horse riders and a lot of horse archers, if I remember rightly. And it's very rare that you hear about the Huns, occupying like towns and cities. Usually they're known for, raiding and taking all the loot back to their camps. And I think what the Romans try to do, which they've done with many barbarians, is trying to civilize the raiders by, give them sort of what they considered useless land on the edges of the empire, which I think, if I remember rightly, Attila, it actually worked with they settled on the Danube River Valley. And one of the weird stories that I've heard about Attila was one of the dignitaries, Roman dignitaries, that went to visit Attila, concealed assassination attempt. Somehow, Attila knew of this attempt. Instead of turning around and having the assassin killed, he sent the frightened assassin back with the gold that he'd be paying to do the deed in a sack tied round his neck. That is one of the weird stories I heard about Attila.
Attila was obliged to allow his followers chance to loot, but his focus would have been on moving quickly and creating such a nuisance that Aetius would be forced to sue for peace. His goal was Aurelianum, an important strategic city. Capturing it would have split Gaul in half, but if that proved not enough to bring the Romans to the negotiating table, he could meet them in battle, defeat them, and extract terms, as he has done before in the east. The Alan leader, Sangiban, must have received word on the approaching Huns. It is possible that he tried to play a duplicitous game, angling to join the side that was most likely to win. There is certainly some debate about his loyalty, but it's likely that he sided with Aetius early on, as the two had a fruitful alliance over the years. Whatever the case, what Attila failed to anticipate was a Romano-Visigothic alliance that could challenge him. Worse, Aetius got to Aurelianum first. He promptly entrenched the outskirts of the city and made it a rallying point for the troops coming from the north. The cunning general cut a deal with the Baguadai and the recent immigrants from Britain, guaranteeing them freedom from imperial authority in exchange for their support. Additional Frankish auxiliaries, Saxons, contingents of outlaws from Armorica, Lyticians and Burgundians were persuaded to join, as well as smaller Sarmatian, Celtic, Swabian and German tribes. Also the Olabriones, who were former Roman soldiers, and the Alans from the Loire Valley. Once Attila arrived, he knew that the defensive position at Aurelianum favoured the Romans. There is some evidence to suggest that he was unsettled by being confronted with Aetius's combined army on unfavourable forested ground around the Loire. Therefore, the Hunnic king withdrew from Aurelianum. He may have expected to take the city without a fight, but since this was no longer possible, he had no choice but to give battle, and he wanted to do so on the ground of his own choosing. He was familiar with the terrain he had already marched through after crossing the Rhine, and knew that the flat Catalaunian fields would favour his army. Mounted contingents and a baggage train would have kept the road, while the infantry made their way cross-country through the forest of Orléans, with the rally point at Senon. Aetius had to delay for a few days, departing from Aurelianum only after all his reinforcements had arrived. He predicted that he will catch up to Attila before he could cross the Seine, roughly an 8-day march. To slow down the enemy, the Roman general dispatched fast-moving contingents of riders ahead of the main army to harass Attila's column in the hilly, heavily forested territory, where there was little room for the Huns to maneuver. While this didn't cause significant losses to Attila, it made resupplying his troops that much more difficult, while the Roman allied army was well provisioned. A large skirmish by Aetius's Franks in the rear of the Hunnic column further slowed down Attila's advance, allowing Aetius to catch up. This forced Attila to leave a sizable rearguard of Gepids to allow the main army to take up position on the fields ahead. In light of the retreat from Aurelianum and having to fight off ambushes and skirmishing attacks over the past 10 days, the morale in the Hunnic army would have suffered. Attila had the added challenge of keeping the spirits up, assuring his followers that the favourable terrain just ahead is where they will make a stand and defeat the Romans. As he reached the open Catalaunian fields, Attila had to make a decision. He was on the defensive, and his army was tiring. He could either risk it all by giving battle, or retreat to fight another day. The Hunnic king was aware that there might not be another day, knowing that an army retreating through hostile territory was like a sick herd, an easy prey. Worse, to run away in the face of the enemy was no way for a warrior to live. Certainly no way for a leader of his stature to retain his authority.
Yeah, because saying that, the kingship among the Huns, I think, were not by divine right or lineage, but who had the strongest will. And at this time, as obvious, Attila was the strongest, had the strongest will, even though he killed his own brother to gain leadership.
Over the many tribal warlords under his command. He would fight the Romans. As June 19th drew to a close, Attila sent a cavalry detachment to occupy a ridge overlooking the valley, recognizing its importance straight away. Further ahead, he encamped on the banks of the Seine, with a wagon fort formed in the front and a bridge to the rear that would provide a vital avenue of escape across the river if things went badly. Towards the southwest, flat open plains extended as far as the eye can see, which would give the Huns advance warning of the approaching enemy. Tonight, his troops would get a good night's rest. Early on June 20th, the morning twilight witnessed a comet ominously piercing through the sky, as if to signal the start of the battle. Soon after, Aetius appeared. Just as Attila suspected, the Roman general had divided his army into two columns, arriving around 7 a.m. Aetius wanted to deploy as early in the day as possible. He needed a quick, decisive battle. The conglomeration of his allies would disperse back to their homes if they became stuck in a prolonged war of attrition. After getting word from his scouts that the Romans are on their way, the Hunnic king began deploying his troops. Crucially, he sent another contingent of cavalry to reinforce the Hunnic riders on the ridge to the south. Unlike Aetius, Attila wanted to start the battle as late in the day as possible. If he could delay until there were only a few hours left before sunset, this would allow him to regroup under the cover of darkness if the Romans got the upper hand. And just as he suspected, Aetius did not want to leave a Hunnic contingent to his rear. While the rest of the army continued towards the battlefield, the Roman general tasked Theodoric's son, Thorismund, commander of the Visigothic cavalry, with taking the ridge. As the Visigoths approached up the slope, the Huns kept their distance. They withdrew slowly, showering the enemy with arrows. The harassment slowed down Thorismund's advance as the nimble horsemen kept retreating out of harm's way. Attila had no intention of fighting for control of the heights, rather on the flat plain below that better suited his army. Deploying his horsemen on the ridge was intended to disrupt Aetius's movements and drag out his deployment. And it seemed like Attila's delaying tactics were working. It wasn't until 11 a.m. that the Visigoths finally gained control of the heights, some 4 hours after the Roman army first appeared on the battlefield. Instead of advancing towards the middle of the field, where he would be vulnerable to encirclement by the fast-moving Huns, Aetius anchored his right flank on the rising slope to the south, and his left wing on the thick forest to the north. Just like Attila, Aetius tried to formulate his own contingency plan by forming his line at the start of the steep meadow that led up to the high lands behind him. If the battle went against him, this would allow him to withdraw uphill where it would have been difficult for the mounted Huns to pursue him. Theodoric and the Visigoths held the right wing. Most of them dismounted to form a shield wall to protect themselves from the Hunnic archers. A small cavalry contingent remained in reserve, commanded by the king himself. The mounted Alans were placed in the centre right. Perhaps doubtful of Sangaban's dedication to the cause, Aetius may have wanted to surround the Alan leader with a host of faithful troops. Rather than forming a shield wall like the rest of the battle array, the Alans...
Okay, I was wrong about the Alans allying with the Huns.
...fought on horseback, similarly to the Huns. Aetius took command in the centre left. From there to the left wing extended the Roman infantry, including the Franks, Burgundians, Saxons, and other allied tribes. Like the Visigoths, the majority formed a shield wall. 2 cavalry contingents were placed in reserve to plug any holes in the line. Meanwhile, Attila observed Aetius's defensive deployment. With the Roman formation tucked into the bottom of the hillside and most of the troops locked in a shield wall, no envelopment would be possible. But even though Aetius's deployment left no option except a frontal assault, Attila had never been defeated in battle, and he was on the battlefield of his own choosing. After all, it was he who crossed the Rhine to wage war on the Romans. Now was his chance to defeat them. He took up position in the centre with his Huns, the core of his army. On the left wing, Ostrogothic cavalry formed in the front. Arrayed in the second line were Germanic footmen, the Burgundians, Thuringians, Alemanni, Rugians, Herulds, and others. On the right wing, Frankish infantry and Gepid cavalry were placed in the front, with another contingent of mixed Germanic infantry in the back. The second line of Germanic infantry on both wings was to serve as a rallying point for the cavalry and to reinforce any attack.
Grammarly can help you write quickly and confidently, so you never have to slow down at work.
Attacks. Just as he had planned, Attila successfully delayed Aetius's deployment. Only 5 to 6 hours remained until sunset. It was time. Attila planned to focus his attack.
And as I said at the beginning, from what I remember learning about what little I know about the Huns was Attila's shaman prophesied that, as I said at the beginning, were prophesied to lose this battle, but the general of the opposing army would be killed.
On the weaker Roman centre right.
That's how the prophecy was meant to go.
He would have seen that the placement of mounted Alans was the most vulnerable point in Aetius's line, and he wanted to take advantage of that. He tasked the Franks and Gepids on the right and the Ostrogoths on the left with pinning down the Romans and Visigoths to allow him time to break the Alans. The Huns attacked in successive waves, maximizing the effect of their archery. To the average Roman soldier, it seemed that the barbarians purposely scattered into smaller bands, rushing about in disorder. The Alan contingent bore the brunt of the storm of arrows, but Attila also focused his volleys on the Visigoths and the Roman centre right in order to support the mounted attack on the wings. He knew that a cavalry charge could break against determined infantry, and he wanted to soften up and disrupt Aetius's ranks before the Ostrogoths, Franks, and Gepids began their charge. The Hunnic barrage continued for hours, giving Aetius's men no respite. The physical and psychological impact on the Romans and Visigoths, cowering behind their shields, must have been immense. The Alans kept responding with barrages of their own, but being mounted and...
That's, from what I remember, that's a typical tactic of horse archers, is ride around in a disorderly fashion while firing arrows towards the enemy. And it's also great for hit and run attacks, because some of these horse archers are so trained that they can fire accurately while riding at almost full gallop on horseback. That's how trained these sort of horse archers were.
stationary made them much easier targets, and as their losses mounted, gaps appeared in their line. Sensing that the concentrated arrow volleys have weakened their resolve, Attila ordered a general charge.
Wow.
On a very narrow front, the Hunnic wedged formation smashed into the Alans, cutting straight through their formation. Overwhelmed, some of the Alans held on while others fled, opening a gap that split the Roman army in two.
That's always one of the best tactics to use with cavalry. Cavalry is a wedge formation because like most of the enemy will try and concentrate on that soldier or soldiers on the front of the wedge. Sometimes they don't focus on the rest of the cavalry that comes in like a triangle. The only way you can counteract a wedge formation is from a normal rank is collapse it in the opposite direction. That's usually one of the best way. That's the best way that I know that to counterattack a wedge formation is if your ranks are that, collapse it backwards in a opposite triangle. So you got this gap, so the wedge will come in here, and then if you got archers nearby, you can fire onto that enemy wedge formation.
Theodoric and Aetius turned their cavalry contingents in a desperate attempt to plug the hole in the center and stop the breakthrough. Either side of the gap, the shock of the Hunnic charge pushed back the enemy, bending their battle lines inwards. Then came Attila's Germanic infantry, adding more impetus to the attack. The men in the front clashed with their shields in close combat, jabbing at the enemy with spears and swords. On the Roman left, the battle swayed back and forth, but the mixed allied infantry managed to slow down the push of the Gepids and the Franks. On the right flank, however, the Visigoths were pressed hard by the combined charge of the Huns, Ostrogoths, and the mixed Germanic infantry. Then, word reached Aetius that King Theodoric was killed in the fighting while rallying his men.
Wow.
Realizing that this was a critical moment in the battle, the Roman general gave the signal to Thorismund. Until now hidden from view behind the crest of the hill, the Visigothic cavalry poured down the slope. Caught off guard, Attila's Germanic infantry faced about to form a line against the incoming cavalry. But without enough time to form a shield wall, they were quickly overrun. In the center, Aetius managed to rally the Alans and stabilize the line. Attila's attempt to steamroll the Roman center had failed, and now his attack stalled. Soon, his left wing fell apart as the Ostrogoths fled the field. To avoid encirclement, Attila too disengaged and retreated towards the fortified camp. Sporadic skirmishing continued until sunset, when all fighting died down. Upon learning of the death of his father, Thorismund wanted to besiege the Hunnic camp and continue the fight on the next day. But some sources claim that, inexplicably, Aetius used his charm to dissuade the Visigothic heir apparent, reminding him that it would be wiser for him to depart for Toulouse to secure his throne. Another story suggests that the Roman general received payment from the Hunnic king and possibly looked to
So basically, the prophecy, what I was talking about, did kind of come true. Because if people were listening, that the prophecy was that the Huns would lose this battle, but the general of the opposing army would be killed. So it was King Theodoric who died and fulfilled the prophecy.
Rebuild the relationship with the Huns, whose mercenaries he could again use to reassert his authority in Gaul. It remains unclear why Aetius didn't press the advantage when he had Attila at his mercy. But in all likelihood, after defeating the Huns, he was faced with the inevitable breakup of his temporary alliance, and thus had no choice but to end the engagement. Whatever the case, Attila was able to withdraw from the field in good order and head back across the Rhine.
Mad.
Stream 16 Days in Berlin now. Experience the Battle of Berlin in this groundbreaking documentary series, filmed on the actual battlefield.
Aetius' accomplishment on the Catalaunian fields cannot be overstated. In defeating the Huns, he demonstrated exceptional leadership, diplomatic, strategic, and tactical prowess, which made him one of the greatest leaders of late antiquity. His former friend Attila didn't succeed in carving out a kingdom in Gaul, but still wielded immense power and was not ready to give up his ambitions against the West. The following year, he surprised Aetius by invading Italy.
Wow.
Aquileia was besieged and captured. Cities across the Po Valley were sacked, although the capital Ravenna was protected by its surrounding.
Yeah, I've heard about Aquileia or Aquileia, however you want to pronounce it. I heard that Attila's attack wiped it from the face of the earth, which I believe is what is now modern day Venice. I could be wrong.
Marshes.
Please let me know in the comments.
Attila continued south before abruptly retreating due to supply shortages and a possible outbreak of plague within his army. He and his troops had already acquired considerable plunder, and many were keen to head back home before winter. In addition, the Eastern Empire began launching offensive operations against Attila's kingdom, which was another reason to withdraw from Italy. While Western Rome did not defeat him, Attila's own power rested on continuous success, and the failure to win an outright victory may have weakened his authority. Nevertheless, he planned to renew his campaign next year. But in early 453 he took a young wife, and after a night of excessive celebration, he was found dead the following morning. The exact cause of his death is not known, but
well, from what I heard and read, he had a nosebleed and choked to death. That's what I remember. So, as I said, I could be wrong.
He left no designated heir, and the fight for the throne among his sons and the many allies making their bids for power caused the Hunnic realm to collapse within just a few years. Fate was not kind to Aetius either. His power began to wane in recent years, ever since he could no longer recruit the Huns to fight for him. And with Attila defeated, his military expertise was less necessary. By 454, the general understood his precarious position and hoped to use his influence over the emperor to secure his position by making sure that the marriage between his son and the emperor's daughter went through. But Emperor Valentinian, now well in his 30s, still resented Aetius. However, he was never able to rule in his own right and was instead influenced by ambitious men at his court. One such man was a senator, Petronius Maximus, who plotted his own rise to power. Exploiting the hatred that Valentinian had for Aetius, the senator persuaded him to lure the general to a meeting in Ravenna. Once there, Valentinian and his eunuch chamberlain attacked Aetius during a discussion and hacked him to death.
I did not know about this.
Still, the instigator Petronius had grander designs. Just a few months later, he recruited 2 of Aetius's bodyguards to murder Valentinian. Soon after, Petronius declared himself emperor. All of the major actors involved in the events surrounding the Catalaunian fields were dead within a few years after the battle. As for the Roman Empire, it would continue to stagger onwards for another 20 years. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible.
And that'll do it. That's an interesting video. I I did not know Aetius or Aetius was assassinated. Wow, that completely caught me by surprise. But yeah, as I said, when it came to Attila's death, what I remember learning was he had a nosebleed and choked to death. There's the odd theory that he was poisoned, which causes nosebleed and caused him to choke, but anyway, this has been another interesting video by History Marsh. If you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next.